It's about regulating your energy in a way that makes it sustainable over time. So I want you to think of flow as less of just a performance tool, it's a creative cycle. When you're in flow, you're not only producing, you're making new connections, you're finding solutions, you're pushing the boundaries of what's possible, which allows you to innovate more. So basically, flow feeds itself, creating this sort of feedback loop of creativity.
Welcome to Everyday Innovation, your go-to podcast for enhancing your creative and entrepreneurial process. I'm Jordan DeVeccia, a multi-passionate creator entrepreneur, venture studio co-founder, and business designer and advisor. Here we live at the intersection of creativity, strategy, and personal development. Join me for inspiring conversations, actionable practices, and insight infusions designed to shift your mindset and empower you with tools and resources to create impactful ventures. Get ready to take your ideas to the next level and innovate with purpose.
Welcome back to the Everyday Innovation Podcast. Today, I'd like to revisit a concept that I believe plays a pivotal role, not just in creativity, but how we approach our daily lives as entrepreneurs, founders, creators. I'm talking about flow, something I've touched on in the past that we've all probably listened to podcasts about, but continues to evolve in the way that I approach it. So hopefully today, when we talk about this, there's something that you can take away that you haven't really thought about in regards to flow before. So, flow is a practice that can really fuel your creative process and how you design your life. It's not just about getting things done, like productivity wise, it's about tapping into that state of mind where everything aligns, where you can sense whether things are working or not, and where the effort feels effortless. Flow is creating that space in your life where you can regularly access clarity and insight. And that's really the goal of this, is to get to that space where you're tapping into that more often. So, as we go through the episode, take a moment to reflect on what activities bring you into a flow state, whether it's driving, working on a project. I'd love to hear how you experience flow. So, as you're listening, if you have a pop of insight, please feel free to, if you're on a Spotify or YouTube, leave a comment. You can even send me a DM. I'm just really interested in what strikes that for you. So, let's get into it. We all have probably experienced like what a flow state is, but truly, when you break it down, I think a lot of people don't talk about this. What are kind of the mechanics of flow, or what kind of a task creates flow? So I feel, and there's a lot of research on this as well, that flow happens when the difficulty of a task is just right. If you are designing your tasks correctly, you are approaching something that's just challenging enough to engage you, but not so hard that it overwhelms you. So let's say this is a very easy example. You're going to the gym, right? If you go to the gym and you continue to pick up a 1 pound weight that, maybe at first was more engaging, but if you just keep using the 1 pound weight and doing reps, you're probably not going to have the correct engagement, the results, or even the like desire to continue working out at the gym if you're just able to use a 1 pound weight. You want to be able to progress. You want to be able to move to a weight that is appropriate for your skill level and also just keeps you and your body engaged, right? Also, if you're solving a complex problem, right? You want to break it down into chunks that feel like you can manage it in that moment. If you try to go straight to like the hardest problem, that may be actually demotivating for you and pull you out of flow because you can't even get a grip on what's working, right? But if you're working on something that's way too easy, you may just get bored, right? That's simple as it is, right? So you want to be absorbed, fully engaged, but not frustrated. When you enter flow, your brain becomes highly efficient. So it uses just enough energy to focus on what's essential while filtering out distractions. So it means you're not overworking and you're not overthinking. You are doing. So this has nuance to it, of course. There are times where what is doing means sometimes we will talk about this later, these kind of low stakes activities where you truly are not even really thinking about it. It's more, you're working more, your body's working autonomously while you're doing something. And there's ones where you're, of course, still thinking through, but it's not that effortful thinking. It is piecing things together, or there is a flow in the logic that's coming through. And this is really more of the flow state. If you're overthinking, you are not in flow. Let's just be honest. And if you're overworking or you feel like it's just so effortful, then you're probably not in flow either. So, achieving flow really is easier said than done, especially when you're constantly pulled in different directions. So, how do you make conditions that will allow flow to be possible? So, there are strategies and techniques that you can use. I'm going to talk about a couple of them here, and these are parts of your process that you can put into place to allow flow to occur. So, for example, I know many of you have heard of the Pomodoro Method. If you haven't, I'm going to explain it quickly for you. So, the Pomodoro Technique is a simple method for managing your time, and you work in intervals. So, usually it's about 25 minutes of focused work followed by a 5-minute break. And then after 4 of those intervals, so 25 minutes with the 5-minute break 4 times, that last 5-minute break turns into a break that's about 15 to 30 minutes. So, it really depends on either the methodology that you're following or it's just your personal preference. It's useful because it builds in rest periods and it helps you avoid burnout. It's also great for motivation purposes to start a task. Sometimes the hardest part of doing anything is just getting started. So I feel like it is a great starter for flow, right? So when you put on a timer, when you say, I'm going to commit, your brain kind of primes itself to get into a space of this is something, I'm now working on something. This is something I'm going to do and that I've committed to for this period of time, but I'm not overthinking that I have to work on it for hours or days or all the different tasks I need to do. If you've done Pomodoro correctly, you've started to break down tasks into something that could be done in a few of these Pomodoro sessions. So, the Pomodoro technique, I think, is a really great place to start and to see where you get into flow, where you don't, or maybe where Pomodoro could help you get through those kind of admin tasks. The things that you feel good to have done, but these aren't necessarily going to be flow activities for you. These are just things that you just need to get through and get started. Maybe it is your going through some emails, or you need to finish up some sort of like a document or whatever else, or maybe you're just cleaning certain things. It might just be getting that started and committing at least those 25 minutes to get it done. And what you'll notice is some of the things that you overhype in your mind of how long they'll take are actually a lot shorter than you realize. And then there's some things that you start to think, oh, I'm just going to keep putting that off. It's only an hour long. And then you start doing Pomodoro techniques or anything that tracks your time a bit better, putting it on your calendar, and you'll start to notice that, oh my gosh, actually, I'm really underestimating this particular task for myself. And maybe that's something to consider in the future. Is this something, and we'll talk about this more in the next episode, is this something that I can keep for myself? Is this like something that's draining my energy? Is this something that's giving me energy? Is it something that feels good to have done? And what do I do with that information? So, the Pomodoro method, like I was saying, when you're going through it and you're tracking it, it brings a lot of structure to the way that you approach tasks. But sometimes it can be a little distracting when you get into flow. So there are some types of activities that'll pull you into flow, but then it feels very frustrating to have to stop in the middle of it. So you're 25 minutes in, you could easily go another 25 minutes. So sometimes you're ignoring your Pomodoro timer, or maybe it gets frustrating. So there is a concept called flow time, and you can check in the show notes, and in the newsletter, there'll be illustration of how that works. But basically, flow time adapts the Pomodoro method by removing the rigid structure of it. So instead of breaking every 25 minutes, you work for as long as you're in flow and only take breaks when you naturally feel your focus fading. So I'm going to give you some examples of tasks that often are associated with flow and also would work well with this. So I used to code a lot, and coding, funny enough, there's sometimes where you could use the Pomodoro method and you're just trying to get through and show up for certain problems or just getting a button done, right? If you're doing front end development. Then there's sometimes where you get into a flow where you're connecting all of these pieces together. And it is so frustrating if you get interrupted. And that's also when you know you might be in flow, is if you get frustrated when you're interrupted. Another example would be writing. So let's say you're writing a manuscript or a book, whatever, and you're sitting down to write. Sometimes putting that Pomodoro on is totally fine because you're like, I just need to get through a page, right? And that putting that timer on helps to get through a page. But then sometimes the writing just pours out of you. So after you do 25 minutes, you're like, that's not enough. I want to write this entire chapter right here, right now. And then leverage that, go for it. So I think, in my opinion, starting with something like Pomodoro can help you get started and start to understand your time better and understand where are you getting frustrated when you have Pomodoro going on. Then you might want to switch over to flow time when you're in those certain activities. So if you're doing admin, if you're doing just things that maybe they don't necessarily have to be frustrating or draining to you. They're just, activities that are not necessarily going to put you in a flow state. You can use Pomodoro for that, but then maybe use flow time when you're doing maybe some deep work in coding, writing, anything that's activating several pieces of your mind, or maybe working on a client project where you're, connecting all of these new ideas, or you're in like a creation mode, putting a lot out, maybe creating a piece of content, something like that, where you may not want to be interrupted. Honestly, just the act of setting a timer and timing yourself, even if you just like use a software like Sunsama or something else or on your phone, just to start a timer, just to see how long you've been doing it. You can always peek over and see, okay, it's been 15, 20, 25 minutes. I've checked that box. I've done the commitment for it, but I'm ready to keep going. And you just take a glance, look away, keep going, right? And it also gives you a good idea. Timing your tasks anyway gives you a good idea of how you're doing, and maybe identify where some of those flow states are. Because if you see very quickly and very easily an hour passes, an hour and a half, 2 hours passes while you're absorbed in something, that might be a good indicator of this is a task that is creating flow, or you have put yourself in a situation or an environment that creates flow. So let's talk about that. Finding your rhythm is key to maintaining flow, but it's not just about the timing. It's also about really making a space where flow can happen naturally. And I say making a space in a couple of ways. I say externally and internally. So let's talk about the external first, or the things that you can do to get yourself in that mindset of having flow by working with the context around you. So, the environment you work in plays a huge role on whether you can access flow. Let's just be honest. This might mean you need certain lighting or music or even scents that signal to your brain that it's time to focus. And this is like a very easy hack that you can use, especially in the beginning, to access that. So having a really cool playlist that you love. So maybe depending on what you're working on, it may be something that there's like a lot of instrumentals or dance music that allows you to access flow. Maybe it's saving some of your favorite music to listen to while you're in flow, things like that, if it really hypes you up. It's really up to you on what the task is and how you can leverage things around you. I love to use scent. So I even have, like right here, I have this rose spray. It's supposed to be very high vibe, right? The rose type of like scent and the actual vibration of the rose. So I kind of leverage the not only the nice smell, but also the meaning behind it to have it at my desk and use it when I want to get into that flow state or that high vibe state as well. So, a favorite candle you could light, you could use a specific scented perfume when you're in that creative flow state. This is like helping you embody that sort of identity. And that's an important point to make as well, is flow is something you can cultivate regularly as well without having to rely on your environment, by seeing it as part of your identity. You're not just someone who occasionally gets into flow, it's somebody who actively seeks out and initiates flow as part of who you are. So think about athletes, artists, top performers. Many of them have a pre-game ritual, pre-performance ritual to do to access flow, or it is just part of who they are. It is, I have to get into flow because I am a top athlete. I have to get into flow because I am a fantastic writer that wants to share something with the world. You can access this as well and just tell your brain, just say, this is part of who I am. I get into flow and I make magic, period. So I want to not underestimate the level of identity work that can happen around flow. And I want to encourage you to say something that flow is not random for me. This is something that is part of who I am. So I want to take a little sidebar here. And I want to talk about the difference between flow state and hyperfocus. Because when we're talking about identity, I think there are a lot of people who have experienced hyperfocus, whether you're neurodivergent, you identify as somebody who's neurodivergent or neurotypical, or you're not really sure. We've all experienced hyperfocus. And I want to identify the difference between the two, because I think that sometimes flow seems unattainable to people because they've experienced hyperfocus. And I'll explain kind of the difference between them and why people might think that. As someone who's neurodivergent, it is part of like my neurotype to experience both hyperfocus and flow, right? Hyperfocus is often triggered in moments of intense concentration, but it is unpredictable. I usually cannot control when it happens, and it usually leads to burnout. And it's also typically related to stress. A lot of neurodivergent people, even neurotypical people, will use like set deadlines to put pressure on their work, which is good. Sometimes a constraint is really helpful, but it's not always sustainable when you're trying to utilize that type of energy to create, right? So a lot of times hyper focus too can come out of undesirable spaces. So let's say you're trying to work on something, a lot of people might be triggered to hyper focus on getting to the bottom of a rabbit hole in true crime or something. And it has nothing to do with any of the goals that they're set out to do. I love a good rabbit hole. I love going on tangents. I think there's always a purpose to them and there's something you could take out of them, but they can also be incredibly distracting and again, super unpredictable. And we don't need to necessarily control every aspect of our lives, but it is good to have intentions behind flow. Hyperfocus is not particularly intentional unless you're trying to create stress. And in that case, it's not particularly sustainable. So over time, that's not going to be a great strategy for you. Flow is something you want to cultivate regularly. It's more sustainable and not situational. So with flow, I can prime myself to get into that state intentionally rather than waiting for the right conditions to trigger it. So I think a lot of people see hyper focus as the same as flow and they know what that kind of magic is, but I almost think of it as I don't want to say I don't want to put it in a negative light, but it's almost that kind of dark magic where it's magical but very unpredictable and chaotic as opposed to something that you can channel positively. But I want to say that if you do experience hyper focus regularly, it can be a superpower. And I want you to start to pay attention to when you get into those hyper focused, like little sprints, whatever it is. What are the things that are triggering that? Is there something you can take from that? Is there anything from your environment that is helping cultivate that? What are the kind of maybe identifying some of the I don't want to say the negatives, but again, what are the things that were you trying to avoid something? Like looking at some of these kind of opposite factors may allow you to have some insights on flow itself and how you can utilize some of the things that come more randomly into your intentional practice. So those are just a couple of things to think about. These are for my people who have experienced hyperfocus and want to move into a state more so of intentionality behind that. So not every flow state has to come from like this intense high energy task, right? Because we're talking a lot about it comes up in productivity a lot and it's always about designing and writing and getting into a flow state when you're performing as an athlete. Sometimes flow happens in these small low stakes activities that allow the mind to wander. And I don't want to discount these because they're really important in your process. So we often, like I said, associate flow with this high effort work, but flow can also happen in repetitive rhythmic activities. So think about driving, walking, cleaning. These activities require enough attention to keep you engaged, right? But are repetitive enough to free your mind for deeper thinking. So for me, driving is a big one. So the act of driving itself engages my brain. I got to pay attention. I am a defensive driver. I grew up in Miami and I live in LA. Come on, we got to like pay attention to the road. But at the same time, my mind is not overthinking. It's not thinking about, luckily, we have enough practice on the road to be aware, but not have to overthink what you're doing as you drive along, right? So I can hold space to think creatively or problem solve. So sometimes I it allows me to better absorb some podcast material that I'm listening to or an audiobook. Sometimes it just helps me think through a problem that I'm trying to solve or maybe a conversation that I need to have. That happens to me a lot too. And I know a lot of other people who podcast often will say they come up with their best ideas for podcasting or they'll record themselves in their car or while they're walking. It's just a natural thing that happens. Even think about showers, right? Shower thoughts. You take a shower and some of your best ideas come there, and it's because you are engaging your body, you're cleaning yourself, but it's not something you have to actively think about. And so it allows your brain to take a break from the other things it usually pays attention to. And by looking at this like repetitive, very easy automatic task, and also free up some conscious space for you to think through something. These low stakes activities also help you regulate your nervous system, creating a balance where you're engaged but you're not overwhelmed. This calm engagement is a prime space for flow. So, again, I think with hyperfocus, there is a nervous system dysregulation that comes with that. So a lot of times people are stressed and they end up going down a rabbit hole of something totally they weren't supposed to, or they put themselves in a deadline to create that dopamine hit of focus. You're not calm. Let's just put it that way. A lot of times you're not hyper focused and have great nervous system regulation. At least in my case, may be different for different people, but when you're in flow, there is a sense of calm about it. So that's something that I want you to look out for in your kind of low stakes activity. If you're calm and cleaning or you're maybe crocheting, for example, like you don't have to overthink that because it's a skill that you've acquired and you can do it over and over again. You may be able to do that without having to look at your template or pattern and think there's something else or chat with ChatGPT, like on your voice notes, right? That's what I love to do is create voice notes and voice prompts to send to ChatGPT while I'm doing something else. And I have the clarity of mind to prompt it well when my brain is calm. When you're in this state, you're not necessarily energized, but you're not necessarily drained either. It's this perfect mental state for flow to happen in the background. It's about regulating your energy in a way that makes it sustainable over time. So I want you to think of flow as less of just a performance tool, it's a creative cycle. When you're in flow, you're not only producing, you're making new connections, you're finding solutions, you're pushing the boundaries of what's possible, which allows you to innovate more. So basically, flow feeds itself, creating this sort of feedback loop of creativity. It is regenerative, like a self sustaining cycle. I don't know if any of you have ever driven a Tesla before, but it has regenerative braking. So as it breaks, it utilizes that energy to feed and charge the battery. So I often feel that flow states are like that. It's a self-sustaining cycle. The more you're in flow, the more energized you typically feel afterwards, or you are at kind of a neutral level, even if the task was mentally demanding. It's like you're kind of filling up your creative reservoir as you grow. After a deep flow session, I often feel more energized, full of new ideas, and I'm also ready to continue. So it's like the effort I put in replenishes itself. And at the very least, if I've done maybe a longer session, I almost feel at a neutral level or I feel depleted, but in a way that doesn't feel like it's drained my energy. It just puts me at this neutral state. It's like after, I don't know if you ever had like a really great workout too, where maybe your muscles feel depleted, but your energy doesn't. It's like kind of this neutral space where yes, no, you don't want to necessarily push anymore, but like mentally, it's kind of like it moved into a new space and now you're thinking creatively. So flow isn't just about getting through tasks, right? It's creating a system of work that supports long-term creativity and sustainability. But to maintain a flow consistently, we have to understand how it connects to energy management, which is what we're going to explore in the next episode. So flow isn't just a state of mind, you want to make it a practice. It's something you can access more regularly by balancing challenge with skill and creating an environment that primes you for focus, even through some of these low stakes, repetitive activities. I want you to disconnect flow from efficiency. You want to fuel your creative process in life design, which makes you more aligned with what's working and what's not working. So, what puts you in a flow state? I know I had mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, but I really want you to now, maybe listening to this, if you have any changes in opinion, I want you to share with me something. Let's explore this together. Maybe there's something that's really interesting that you hadn't considered before, like cooking, right? And don't forget in the next episode to join me when we talk about energy management, how to structure your day in ways that support flow. Rate the podcast, go on Apple, leave a review. That would be awesome. And please share this with a friend. And if you'd like, go to everydayinnovation.io and you'll get extra resources relating to this subject. And you can listen to and explore resources from past episodes. Thank you so much.